The sand lay blue in the moonlight, and the iron tires of the wagons rolled among the shapes of the riders in gleaming hoops that veered and wheeled woundedly and vaguely navigational like slender astrolabes, and the polished shoes of the horses kept hasping up like a myriad of eyes winking across the desert floor. They watched storms out there so distant they could not be heard. The silent lightning, flaring sheetwise, and the thin black spine of the mountain chain fluttering and sucked away again in the dark. They saw wild horses racing on the plain, pounding their shadows down the night and leaving in the moonlight a vaporous dust like the palest strain of their passing.
That night they rode through a region electric and wild, where strange shapes of soft blue fire ran over the metal of the horses' trappings, and the wagon wheels rolled in hoops of fire, and little shapes of pale blue light came to perch in the ears of the horses and in the beards of the men. All night sheet lightning quaked sourceless to the west beyond the midnight thunderheads, making a bluish day of the distant desert, the mountains on the sudden skyline stark and black and livid, like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone but fear. The thunder moved up from the southwest, and lightning lit the desert all about them, blue and barren, great clanging reaches ordered out of the absolute night, like some demon kingdom summoned up, or changeling land that come the day would leave them neither trace nor smoke nor ruin more than any troubling dream.
Hello, how you doing, JVH?
I'm great, Candy. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good
Pretty
to see
good.
you.
Good to see you too. Um, how are things going around there?
Oh, things are they're warming up, I guess. It feels a little bit like spring is
Well,
on its
that's
early
good.
way.
That's good. Well, I had a lot of weather since we last recorded because I went to Albuquerque for a
Oh,
conference. And so we had to outrun storms, snowstorms were closing down the highways, and then it was beautiful in Albuquerque and had a great conference. Pop culture conference out in Annual. It's very good. I
right.
recommend other people go to it, apply to it, submit for Cormac McCarthy papers. There's usually a panel there. There wasn't this year, but there usually is. Um, and if I find out who the area chair is, I'll announce it sometime on one of our podcasts. Although I'm sure that they will email everyone. Um, Great reading, great, interesting chapter. I feel like this novel has taken a turn. It's like a paradigm shift in the novel. The first three chapters to me felt like, oh, here comes one of the cats. Felt like, you could read them like short stories. They kind of, I felt satisfied. Everything was explained. It was straightforward. This is something different starts happening in this chapter. The pacing is different. The mood is different. And, I found it a bit of a surprise approaching it just this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that there a significant turn is
Mhm.
happens in this chapter. Like we were talking earlier, and I was kind of saying, like Cormac McCarthy seems kind of a fairly conventional literary author in that he takes seriously the kinds of literary conventions that, have been going back to ancient Greece and Rome. And, like I know you love the Renaissance, and we're both fans of Edmund Spenser. And Spenser kind of had borrowing from the Roman poet or Latin poet Virgil.
Mm.
Kind of had this idea that you know if you wanted to be a professional writer, you go through certain stages. And some of these stages can be defined in terms of genre. So, like before Virgil wrote the epic Aeneid, the kind of Roman answer to Homer's Greek
Mm.
epics, he was writing pastorals, and so like Spencer kind of took this very seriously. So, in his own literary career, he was writing kind of pastoral poetry like the Shepherd's Calendar before he allowed himself, before he thought he was actually ready and maybe even worthy of writing an epic,
Mm.
or, what he would consider to be an epic. And for Spencer, it kind of had to do with war, right? So the Fairy Queen is, well, it's not an epic like Homer or Virgil. It's an allegory, and it's an allegorical epic, but it still has that kind of epic feel, that grandeur and sweep and sublimity. And, like thinking about Cormac McCarthy's own kind of literary trajectory, the first four novels, they're all kind of pastoral in one way or another, like The Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark is very, much just a kind of pastoral novel. Child of God is like a horribly perverse, kind of pastoral novel. And then Suttree is, and then from, after Suttree, we get Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
And, Blood Meridian is, well, I wouldn't characterize it generically as an epic,
Mm.
but it definitely becomes, more epical. Like, I sort of feel like Blood Meridian, or I characterize Blood Meridian as an allegorical narrative, or a narrative allegory. And, allegory tends to be a kind of a split discourse. On the one hand, we have the literal narrative. On the other hand, through word choice and other kinds of rhetorical strategies, we have the figurative meaning. And so, like, in some way, the literal narrative of the first three chapters is very pastoral. And, like you said, kind of like complete little vignettes
Mhm.
of, this kind of wandering,
Mhm.
um, poverty stricken, um, sort of character. But, in chapter four, things start to change and the scope becomes grander. And, even though it ends in like catastrophe, we start to get this kind of sense that the novel is becoming different than what it how it started, and also, from the previous novels.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I feel like I feel like I just kind of grasped some of your ideas about allegory. And let me see if I'm understanding. So on one hand, there's the literal meaning of the story. And then there's like, it could be that it's about Caesar and Brutus or something allegorically, or the star, like maybe a god, Medea or something. Would that be right? And you don't need
Yeah.
the other to appreciate it.
Yeah, you never really, I mean, you never really need the figurative meaning to appreciate it, right? Like, so The Wizard of Oz was actually a kind of an allegory of, anxieties over the gold standard in its day, but nobody
Oh,
watches The Wizard of Oz to think about money, right?
I had no idea.
Well, I didn't either until somebody else told me that.
Well, and then someone told me that Stanley Kubrick's The Shining was also about the gold standard.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
And Kubrick actually said on many different occasions that the kinds of stories he likes to tell are allegories.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like, like allegory is on the one hand something like forward driven, like it's a literal narrative. So we have the literal narrative of the Glanton gang,
Right.
but, that literal narrative is kind of captured in a structure of meaning, which could be called the figure of the novel, or the figurative meaning. And yeah, so in some ways, the literal narrative journeys through the different kinds of levels of meaning. And,
Mm.
I kind of think the novel has, like philosophical meanings and scientific meanings and literary meanings, and
Definitely.
about history and about God and about technology.
Hmm.
So the the literal story allows the writer to kind of contemplate these grander themes in various ways.
Well, I had heard that John Hillcoat, who's doing Blood Meridian, he is treating it like a Faustian story, which that would be an allegory, I suppose, of you're
Absolutely,
reading
yeah.
the Western, but the allegory he's going to work with is Faustian.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
makes, I mean, that really makes sense. And of course, like McCarthy himself kind of, well, he had this kind of weird Germanic thing going on during the writing of Blood Meridian,
Oh,
according
really?
to archival scholars. Like he was writing his editor, Albert Erskine, like various kinds of things about German literature and German thought.
Hmm.
You know, the chapter subheading phrase later in the chapter. Wait, what am I trying to think of? Sie müssen schlafen, aber ich muss tanzen, right? Like
Yes.
that's a line from a romantic German romantic poet named Theodor Storm, and that line is taken up by a modernist writer named Thomas Mann. But McCarthy in the archives kind of mistakenly or on purpose, fully mistakenly attributes that line to Goethe's Faust. So Faust
Ah,
was definitely on his mind when he was writing,
right.
and of course, I guess like, Faust and Mephistopheles,
Mm.
we kind of get a parody of that relationship in The Kid and the Judge, but the kid
That's
is no Faust.
no, and he doesn't even know he's made a bargain. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
He
Thank you.
doesn't even know that. Yeah. Okay. I feel like I'm getting a little bit more understanding of that and how you and I are gonna both deal with that. Um, I was thinking one thing we wanted to talk about, and I don't know if we're super ready to get into that, is a bit about the narrator again, which we've mentioned before. Like, who is this person talking? And one thing I noticed was that I found myself being driven into this chapter, partly because early in the chapter it says something like they moved on, and they moved on. It might say it two or three times, and
Yeah,
I found it really pulled me. And then we were talking about I don't know if we want to go into similes right now, but we talked about, oh, we should talk about some of the similes. And then you said when we had a phone call the other day, you're like, well, you have to also find some similes too, Candy. So I was like, oh my God, I better find some. So I read the whole thing and wrote down every one that I could notice that was a very obvious simile. Because I suppose some similes really, I would call them when you invert in a sentence another image, that could be a form of simile. But I really took the ones that literally said, like, a scarf, like scarves of dust.
yeah,
So we
yeah.
might talk about that on this episode. We
We
might
definitely
talk
can.
about paleness. In that you had talked about, and we noticed both of you pointed it out. Now I feel like I'll never unsee it, about chapter two being whiteness and chapter three, no, chapter two having blackness, chapter three having whiteness. I noticed that all these 1970s Western movies, they had gone through a trend like McCabe and Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, or Sundance, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They often had this kind of sepia old film, or they would even go into a sienna colored film, and you're supposed to feel like you're in the old west or something, and yet McCarthy chooses to go into black and white here, maybe like the old black and white westerns, but he has a lot of black and white um, descriptors, which I might just mention a little bit because I did write some of them down too.
Yeah. I
um,
mean, we're about to meet Black and White Jackson. Black Jackson and White
Very
Jackson.
soon, very soon, you're right. So some of these pale things, let me just read them out quickly. Like the palest stain of their passing, wolves paler yet, scarves of dust, blackened rib backs, pale streaks, pencil lines, elongate like strands of the night, cool dark, firelight, dried and blackened, palest, so white and polished, white noon, ghost army so pale, erased upon a board, chalk and blackboard, black and white, obviously, white hot stars, polished bright as chrome, blue cordilleras, paler image, panes of dust, white and with dust thick as mustaches, bone palings, unbleached and cracked like old porcelain, which is crackler, and dusty
Mm.
purluius, dry brown weather cracks, windings of white cotton, urine-colored sun, some were pale. That's just the ones I kind of really tried to notice. And that also
Yeah.
seemed to be like this weird, almost got me into like a black and white film vibe where you get drawn into it, with the incantatory writing that all of a sudden manifested.
Yeah.
And then,
It's a lot of repetition, like,
yes.
and we're gonna, we will talk about like rhetorical figures and stuff. Obviously, like throughout the rest
Mm,
of the podcast,
mm,
and we probably already started talking about them. But repetition is a really important figure of speech. Like, we repeat, or, phrases repeat for various reasons to add emotional emphasis. I mean, for so many different reasons. And so all of this repetition of black and white and pale are really
mm,
interesting. And,
mhm.
the first thing I thought of when you were um, saying all those lines was, how on the very first page of the novel, the kid is described as pale.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. And I think we might even think that McCarthy was into Nabokov and Pale Fire, which would
Oh
have
my
been
God.
a massive publication when he was a young man.
That's incredible. I never really made the connection. I think, in our previous conversations
Mm,
about what you were getting at with pale, because there is actually kind of a direct um, allusion to pale fire in this chapter, like in the climactic
mhm.
attack by the Comanches. The Comanches are at one point described as death hilarious,
Yeah.
and death hilarious. I mean, those two words are so unusually put together
Yes.
that it could only be a reference to a phrase in Pale Fire where Charles Kinbote is talking about, I don't know, Jacob Gradis's journey to assassinate him or something, because
Mm,
he's this paranoid, delusional, great character,
yeah.
incredible. But yeah, he says at one point, he says about some conspirators that they were laughing, and then it's like a little phrase, "Death is hilarious."
Hmm.
So where else could have
Where
McCarthy
else?
got "Death hilarious" than from
Correct.
Nabokov?
Correct. And he in Pale Fire, there's a chapter A in Arcadia Ego. So that could have, it's possible that's where he
That's
first heard the
incredible.
phrase. Yes,
Yeah.
one of the chapters is called that. Um, there's an epigraph in Pale Fire too, which I don't know if it's relevant or not, but it reminded me of how we were looking at how he constructed those epigraphs in our special bonus episode. And the epigraph in this is, "This reminds me of the ludicrous account he gave Mr. Langston of the despicable state of a young gentleman of good family. Sir, when I heard of him last, he was running about town shooting cats. And then in a sort of kindly reverie, he bethought himself of his own favorite cat, and said, 'But Hodge shan't be shot. No, no, Hodge shall not be shot.'" I thought there was a lot in there about the rumor of Reverend Green, starting a rumor, your own fear, and then the denial, because we're going to come across a major denial eventually in Blood Meridian, a miscalculation on the kid's part. Shakespeare and Pale Fire comes from Shakespeare, most likely. I don't know where
Yes,
Shakespeare got it from.
100% it
Yeah, the
does.
moon's an errant thief. Her pale fire she snatches from the sun. That's from Timmons of Athens. And he also has it in Hamlet. The glow worm gins to pale ineffectual fire. So, he's not
Well, like, so thank you for reading that. Like, and I'm
okay.
just going
Sorry
off the
about
top
that.
of,
Yeah.
I'm just going off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
like, he's using Shakespeare's Timon of Athens or whatever
Hmm.
as an epigraph. Timon of Athens is a really important kind of proof text for Melville's The Confidence Man.
Hmm.
You know,
Mm.
um, like Timon of Athens is like he's like somebody who becomes a misanthropist, starts to hate all all of
Yeah.
humanity after realizing that all he had were fair weather friends or something like that.
Yeah. That's a
Uh,
tough
and
lesson.
and Melville like makes a lot of that in the Confidence Man. Like, why trust anybody? Because it's just going to end up like everyone is a fair weather friend, and
Well,
so
what? Go ahead.
yeah,
Go
the
ahead.
whole idea of trusting
Yes.
your fellow human being is of really, great consequence, I think, in Melville's story.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
obviously, there's like zero trust among any of the characters in Blood
Yes.
Meridian,
Well, yes, and I think, it's funny, I'm obsessed with serial
or very much.
killers and disenfranchisement. Um, and a kind of an anarchist terrorist, but not anarchist. I meant anarchist in the time of 150 years ago. But The Confidence Man and the one of my favorite novels, The Secret Agent, they are some of the best portrayals of that what happens when you get alienated from friendships. And we're looking at that obviously with bullies. They turn out that kids tease them or they were misfits or something. And certainly McCarthy has that in some of his characters. And he must have been greatly influenced by it. So I like that. It's funny how it comes back to Confidence Man and
Yeah, like you were mentioning earlier about, you know, who is this narrator anyways?
yeah,
And, like, who is this narrator that they're quoting Vladimir Nabokov? And that's kind of anachronistic, right? This is a
yes, it
novel
is.
about 1850, but he's quoting somebody from the 1950s.
Yes,
So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, the narrator is super elusive. I don't know. Would you say that the narrator is also the author of the chapter subheadings?
that's a
Because
great question.
we know we were
Oh,
noticing this time that the very first chapter subheading of chapter 4 is setting forth.
yes,
Like, so in the fourth chapter we
yes,
get this pun on fourth.
yes.
Like, so that is like kind of very subtly humorous.
It is subtly humorous.
So it's like again, like kind of like a learned author who's like playing around with his learning a little bit, and but then sometimes the narrator seems like right there in the action,
Well, I'm
so
glad you mentioned that. And I saw a massive change in this chapter. I saw two versions of the narrator, um, which would go through our similes. We can talk about some of the similes. And I had I noticed an awful lot of similes. And then in the climax scene, I only found three. But we'd had at least 15 before that were
right.
very, so it almost takes you out of being objective. In a weird way, similes stop you from or stop me from being objective. I was seduced by them. I'm caught up in them and ooh, the writing and oh my God, how can that be like that? And then all of a sudden, the tone of the narrator in that climax, which is about a page and a half of intense action, which we can pinpoint exactly what that is in a few minutes, maybe if we want to go through the chapter. But I was like, wow, the whole tone of it came right into the moment that brings you into the battle. Whereas before, oh, look at, I can sit here and watch the beautiful colors of black and white, and
Yeah.
the horses are starving and they're hungry and they can't sleep. It was really a turn.
Yeah,
Quite
like in that, just to, I guess, talk about the narrator a little bit more on that.
yes.
You get that when the Comanche attack, and you know which is an amazingly constructed scene for a variety of reasons, partially humorous. Like,
Yeah.
I remember, Rick Wallach always loving that line, "Oh my God," said the sergeant. Like, it's just so funny.
Right.
But when the narrator at the beginning of the attack, I think it's at the beginning of the attack or something, or maybe it's in the middle. Anyway, it doesn't matter, where the narrators uses the second person address. He says, "You could see this, and you could
Yes.
see that, and you could see this, and you could see that." It's sort of like
Mm,
a person. It was like a witness, giving testimony about what they survived and stuff like that. So
right.
it's the narrator is like, I guess, like the temporal bandwidth of the narrator is very variable. Like,
Right.
sometimes the narrator like just sort of like shrinks to the literal moment of the narrative action. So he's right there in 1849 or whatever. But then sometimes, it just the temporal bandwidth of the narrator just sort of expands outward, and suddenly like Nabokov is here. And like, well, we noticed, I don't did we ever talk about the taxi driver thing?
No, we didn't talk about it. That's in the first chapter, I think.
Yeah, that's in the first chapter,
Eight.
where somebody says the very famous taxi driver line.
Right.
Are
They're
you
talking to somebody and he turns around and are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So there is that, where that's very tricky and you are pulled out of it. There's a lot of anachronisms in the novel actually, which I guess we'll discover, including the tarot cards. Um,
And I think anachronism is purposeful,
I
and I
think it,
actually think it has something to do with simile. So,
oh,
like, a simile is, you know, rhetoricians have always kind of thought simile to be the more boring
yeah.
sibling of metaphor, right? Because metaphor just says A is B and it's all dramatic, and but simile is more rational. Goes the standard account of simile, like A is like B. That's a very rational thing to say, like it's not B, but it's like B. So
Yeah.
there's some kind of shared attribute that A and B both, have that allows for the production of the simile. But
Mhm.
if you think about, like, again, like if we're talking about the narrator as kind of having this rather expansive temporal band or historical bandwidth, in a way, like, this is a historical novel, but it's not a novel that divorces itself from the history that it's narrating. By
Mhm.
which I mean, I think the history of the novel has the structure of a simile in the sense of what happened in 1849 is like what happened in
Vietnam.
1970 in Vietnam, or
Yep.
or in 1950 between the American and Chinese at the Yalu River,
Mhm.
or whatever.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so history, like, for the artist, history can take on this structure of a simile, and that also kind of helps the reader realize that I'm not divorced from this history that I'm reading about. It's
Yes.
actually I'm part of it, and my time is like that, is still like that other time.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, and I think if you don't look at these little details, then you are missing something important in the book. I think the purpose of the book, the purpose of the novel will be missed. You know, I've mentioned this a couple of episodes ago that I got booze at two conferences when I said that as much as I love the language of Blood Meridian, it's colonizer speak. And the thing is, it actually is. The narrator's a racist asshole in sometimes. A beautiful poet, and great storyteller. But one example of this is when I did a double take when I was reading. Okay, so what we have happen, let's talk about the chapter a little bit. We have it begin that they set out with Captain White. So the kid, we don't know what's going to happen, but it turns out he does get adopted. He gets consigned into this tour, and they start going out in the desert. They're going to head towards Mexico, maybe. So they cross rivers, and we see, and what happens is they eventually don't have very much food. They are not comfortable. It's literally hell on wheels because they describe these wagon wheels as wearing out and chipping and breaking. And within a couple of days, within 10 days, four people have died because they get cholera. And they just start dropping and they try to save them and they just stick them in the desert and cover them in stones. And they're going further and further along. And the next thing you know, they're looking out over the vast desert and they see herds, a huge herd of, they think it's goats. Is it cows? Is it horses? Well, there's 10 riders, maybe 12, maybe a dozen, because they can't tell. They can't count. We mentioned that earlier, how difficult it is to actually count a group. And it turns out to be a shock that they are the fabled horse riders that hide behind their horse side saddle and hang down and jump up right when they're 20 feet from you or 50 feet from you. So they get completely shocked. But before they get that, right before you find out, the narrator describes them as a Mongol horde. And, that's not right because it's out of date. But I think that McCarthy wasn't being out of date with it. I think he was summoning that kind of dismissive thing that you just talk about. Oh, well, they're just a Mongol horde. They just coincidentally traveled all over Asia, wreaking havoc. In the last 15 years, there's been several works done about the Mongol horde where they're actually incredibly impressive communities of people that innovated. They took over the collapse of the Roman Empire, maybe even helped it, and um, were able to speak different languages with dozens and dozens of other societies, and they were almost like a global citizen. They might have been the original global citizen, really. So Mongol horde is not an appropriate term. It is a racist term, and it just was funny. And it's certainly there's racism in McCarthy's books. His characters say words that we wouldn't feel comfortable using today and would be completely inappropriate, especially in an educational setting. Um, so there is
And
that
the
weird feeling.
narrator too, yeah.
And the narrator too, exactly. And I do not put that on McCarthy. I put it on this character. So you're starting to find out who is telling this story. That's my point. Was when I see that, I'm going, oh my God, this happened sooner than I thought it was going to happen in the novel. I thought it was maybe something I felt once the climax of the novel actually happens at the end of the novel. Then I'm like, wait a second. The first time I read it, maybe even the first three times, I was like, what happened here? How come I didn't see this coming? How come I don't understand what happened? I mean, maybe other people. I know people think that the kid got killed by the judge. We can talk about that another time. I don't think that's what happened. And I think what I'm saying today is part of my evidence why I don't think it mattered whether he got killed or not, because we're talking about who's telling the story. And that is
Right,
a
right.
a huge part of this novel.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. Like I agree with what you're saying, and and the narrator being like if the narrator has this kind of like in my perspective, it has kind of a temporal bandwidth. So
yes,
can
no, I think that's a
can
brilliant way
can
to put it.
can talk like, a 19th century like
Mm-hmm.
racist
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-Saxon, like
Mm-hmm.
um, can talk like that, but also can talk in other ways that are not like that at all. And for me, it's sort of like it's a way in which the present can't judge the past in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like because it is part of the past. So in some ways, I feel like the way the narrator can um, you know be used to sort of show like 19th century racist discourse or something like that, but at the same time, I don't know, talk about Nabokov or Vietnam or whatever, that this isn't a way of saying to the reader, you're part of this history. And so like the shame
Mm-hmm.
of history is still your shame,
Yeah.
like at the end of Kafka's The Trial, right? The shame will outlive us.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. No, I
so
think you're
so
the temporal, what did you describe the
bandwidth,
name?
yeah,
Yeah, that's a
bandwidth.
brilliant way to put it. Temporal bandwidth is incredible.
I
Which,
think I'm stealing that from Thomas Pynchon.
oh my
I don't
God, well,
I
what a
don't
great
know
person to steal from.
I don't know, maybe Mason and Dixon. I don't remember.
Maybe.
But he has this idea of the temporal bandwidth.
Oh, damn. Well, I think that does make sense. And I'm not saying it's wrong to tell the story with this way. I think it's important to notice it. That's really all I want to say.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
yes.
Yeah.
And it's part of what is the mysterious, interesting layers in this book. Um, yeah. And to make me think about the chapter synoptic chapter headers, I'm gonna say they must be written by the narrator too, because they travel through time as well. I
They
noticed
definitely do. Yes,
they
absolutely. Yeah.
do, and they're punning, like you said, setting forth. I noticed that it said the next thing is on alien ground. Well, I looked at that and I suddenly saw it on alien ground. Lien, like a legal term for who owns this land.
Ah, nice.
So, I started really, I've spent a fair bit of time with those chapter headers. Um,
Well,
but
my
there's
my sort
always
of
more
like,
time to be spent.
oh yeah. My like unserious a reading of On Alien Ground would be like, well, alien is another, actually, it's a Latin word for other.
Yes.
So on other ground, but alien is also, allos in ancient Greek, which is the prefix of the word allegory. Allegory means
Oh my
other,
God.
other, an other way or a way to speak otherwise than openly in a public place.
Oh, yes, for safety.
So
around
yeah,
censorship.
so it's allos and
Yeah,
agorain.
yeah,
And agorain basically means to speak in the agora, which was like the public assembly in,
right.
well, the
Yeah,
the assembly for free men in
yeah,
ancient
yeah.
Athens. So
Well,
to speak like cryptically
yes,
in the open.
yes. Well, a lot of suppressed design and secret architecture, not all of it, is to put things that are to avoid censorship, to
Yes.
avoid, in Shakespeare's time, you could be beheaded for being a Catholic, and they put your head on a stake. And you were, it was a terrorist state at the time. He lived in a terrorist state, and it's partly why his work is still relevant to us because we live in a terrorist state. So,
Well, yeah, and one of the great important words in Macbeth is equivocate,
oh,
which was like equivocation was a way for Catholics to speak and kind of lie, but not lie in their hearts. So God knows they're telling the truth, but
oh,
you may not know because you when you equivocate, you say half truths basically.
hmm. That's very
So
C.S. Lewis. Huh.
there,
Wow.
there's probably a fair amount of equivocation in Blood Meridian, and because it's an allegory, and maybe you and I probably are on the same page, thinking that the context that McCarthy grew up writing was a fairly like censorship heavy one, right? Like,
True.
um, so you have to kind of communicate equivocally
Hmm. Hmm.
under certain circumstances, I guess.
And I think also in your family, he had an overbearing father, it sounds like, that was perhaps critical of him. So you find ways to exist in that way. You find ways to get around.
Yeah, in Melville's family is very conservative, and
Mm.
he was an abolitionist.
Oh,
So
wow.
Moby Dick is anti-slavery, but it's a anti-slavery allegory because, on the one hand, he had to say no to slavery. On the other hand, he didn't want to alienate his
Hmm.
family and cause
Hmm.
them extra trouble or something like that.
Hmm. Right. That makes sense. Um, wow. You mentioned another word. I don't know if we want to talk about it today. Um, is chiasma relevant to our conversation today, or will we
Well,
save?
I'd like to save that for
Yeah,
chapter
okay.
six.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, for chapter 7. Okay, good.
Six. Wait, we're on
6.
chapter 4.
Yeah.
So at the basically, like Blood Meridian has it has this historical kernel that McCarthy takes from Chamberlain,
Hmm.
and that kernel I think starts in either chapter 6 or chapter 7, right? And it goes to chapter 20
20.
something.
Yeah.
And then we have what happens after the Glanton gang has been massacred by the Yumas.
Yeah.
And all of that is made up, right?
Mm.
That McCarthy has made all the end up, and
Hmm.
he's made up the entire beginning.
Hmm.
So we have this kind of historical kernel wrapped in this imaginative framework. And to me, that perfectly captures what this kind of allegory is. It takes a historical material and it basically abstracts it to
Mm.
make it mean something new.
Mm.
So the imaginative framework around the historical kernel
So
is
interesting. So interesting. Um, one of the things we read today, our cold opening was the St. Elmo's fire. I've never seen some St. Elmo's fire. Have you?
I don't think so,
I
no.
don't think so either. And I say it in surprise because my family were boaters. We were on the water and outdoorsy, and I've still never seen it. I would really like to see it. And
That
St.
would be
Elmo's,
amazing. I grew up in the landlocked in the prairies,
yeah,
so
but the prairies they must have some kind of they have massive electrical storms there in southern
oh, we
Alberta.
have the Northern Lights for
Northern
sure.
Lights, that's true.
Just
Yeah.
outside of Calgary, even just a little bit north, you
It's
can see
also
that.
called witch fire.
Witch fire.
And the Welsh term is candles of the Holy Ghost or candles of Saint David. In Russian, it's Saint Hermes fire. So it's hermetical.
Hermes.
Yeah.
Right.
And Saint Helen's fire. In ancient Greece, it was called Hellene for torch. I guess that's the word for torch. And
Interesting.
also called the body of Saint Anselm. Corposcence and corpuscence is a really interesting way of looking at it too. I just thought that would be cool because we did open up with that description of St. Elmo's fire. Okay, I'm really thinking about this rhetoric. I feel a lot stronger about it now. About
Yeah,
rhetoric.
like, and there are similes, in chapters 1 through 3,
There
obviously,
are.
but I feel, and also, did you notice that in chapter 4 we have the first chapter, which is like totally unbroken. There's no
Oh
section
yeah.
breaks.
Right.
It's just one thing.
Right.
And I think in a way that's very epical, just this one big long stretch of narrative.
Hmm.
Um,
Which must
and
have affected my feeling reading it too.
maybe the pacing
The
and stuff. Yeah.
driving. Yeah,
Yeah.
driving.
And,
Well,
like one of the features of epic poetry, since Homer, obviously,
hmm.
is the epic simile. So
No,
I
what
don't
is
think
that?
it's like I don't think it's actually a surprise that the similes really start, that McCarthy like tapped the keg of similes in his word hoard and really just started to let them fly, right? Like
He sure
because
did.
it really starts, and there's even like, and I don't have my copy of Blood Meridian on me, which is
Okay.
really annoying to me right now, dear listener.
Um,
But even there are some sentences which are like one simile and then another immediately, like
true.
so that
True.
it just starts piling on. And I think in a way it's because the narrative itself is becoming more epical.
Yeah.
So like an epic simile for, in the Homeric tradition usually meant a kind of a specific thing. So I don't think we technically have a lot of epic, like Homeric epic similes in Blood Meridian, because usually it's sort of like in the epic simile, you have the normal simile structure, like A is like B, but in Homer, you tend to have the B then be described at great length.
Right.
So the simile, like there's so many different kinds of similes, and even in this chapter, it's actually really wonderful to see. Like, you get a kind of natural simile, like the ponies were whimpering like dogs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and there you can actually kind of like, in a way, like when Homer wrote his epic similes, he was writing them for readers probably who maybe didn't have experience in war. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of his epic similes were actually like, this war thing is like this peace thing, like, and
Mm-hmm.
then he'll go into a long description of farming, or
Right.
or whatever.
Right. I was going to say a simile helps us, especially when it's a setting that we don't know about, or work if it's a workspace we don't know about, or anything happening. A simile, the writer is helping us see what it
That's
feels
right.
like because
Yeah.
we can't be there. It's
Yeah.
almost like sci-fi, And I'm glad you mentioned the dogs yammering because there were interconnected similes in this chapter. On page 46, the wolves were yammering. Then um a mule had were the mules were mallet-headed, which was really funny to think of mules being mallet-headed. Then there were horse sounds like dogs, as you said, and the Comanches were yammering. So he's connecting the Comanches to the wolves and that's page 46 to page 55, near the beginning of the chapter and near the end. So, in terms of Chris Forbes or Kelly James's palindrome, there was almost a palindrome in there.
Mm.
Um, and
Well, speaking of like the kind of, the racism of the narrator, like
yeah.
equating, in a way, like the narrator, by using that same verb yammering, of wolves and the Comanche, kind of equating or kind of
Hmm.
animalizing the Comanches, right? And Toni Morrison has this book called Playing in the Dark, about sort of like the history of American literature, and she talks about how there are certain kinds of ways to sort of denigrate or humiliate another group. And one of those ways is to kind of go through a process of what she calls metaphysical condensation, which basically means, well, which is like animalizing, right?
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
reducing an entire culture to nature, basically, and
Yeah. Well, tell me about it. I mean, as a female, the worst thing you can do is speak. A woman's voice is one of the most hated things on the planet, probably. And it's called yammering or yapping or talking on the phone. One time I made a
Yeah.
movie and I thought, oh, how could I make the scariest movie? Oh, I'll have a woman talking on the phone. It'll terrify men, right? Because, women on the phone, they get teased about talking on the phone, teased about speaking, you know? Bruce Springsteen's song, Because the Night, Patty Smith covers it, and she says, love is the ring of a telephone. Bruce Springsteen never says that line. He never, because why would a man say that? It wouldn't make sense. No, men are sitting around waiting for a lover to call them, right?
Right.
So yes, I do think that it's very true, and of course, Toni Morrison would write an incredible um, piece of work on that.
Oh yeah.
Definitely.
But like the ponies, yeah, sorry, whimpering like dogs.
Yeah.
Like I've never been to war, and I'm also don't know ponies, right? But I can imagine a whimpering dog.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of simile where one
Correct.
one thing is compared to another thing in the same group,
That
sort
you
of.
know. That you know.
So here we have like two animals that are compared, and I'm not familiar with ponies, so the likening of them to whimpering dogs helps me produce an image, right?
Mhm.
And that's also really important for writers because, as William Burroughs said, writers use words to evoke images. So
Yes.
similes can help do that.
Completely
But
true.
but then there are those other similes, like
Well, let's see
this.
if I can we
Yeah,
find
can you
one.
can you
Let me
read
see if I
the
can find one.
geology of fear one?
I can read the Geology of Fear one. Yeah, let me find that. I was going to say we were both taken with
Oh
Horizon
yeah.
Flat and True as a spirit level.
Oh yes, we should definitely
Yeah, we
talk.
should talk about that. Um, and the other one was oh well, the sun comes up like a great phallus. Remember that
There's
one?
that. Oh, and
Yep.
I want to talk about uh the the filibusters described as pilgrims on the planet Anarita. Or
Yes.
like
Yes.
there's that one too we should talk about. But let's
Definitely.
talk about the first one. Westward the horizon lay flat and true as a spirit
Okay.
level.
Okay.
What do
Well,
you take from that?
well, first of all, for me, it's an alchemical magic thing. It's part of being a magician and creating such. It has to do with gravity. So it immediately makes me think of a plumb line, which would be its counterpart tool. And a spirit level is alcohol, a tube, and you put an air bubble in there. It's so simple, and the gravity makes it, go to the top where it's level. It's so brilliant. It was invented in 1661 and by a French guy. I've got his name here somewhere. Thervelo. That's his last name. I can't. His first name's a little more difficult. Um, and that's in that same time period of the Renaissance, which is really funny because they were practicing magic, and magic is observing the world and observing nature, in on one hand, right? And you're going to get all that science coming out of it. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
flat and true
definitely.
as a spirit level is so beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And I mean, it's a tool for masons, right?
Correct.
And for stonemasons.
Yes.
So I mean, I didn't reread the stonemason for this episode, but
We
there,
will later.
stonemasonry is really important for McCarthy, and
Yeah.
obviously, like stonemasonry is a real vocation.
Yeah.
It's you work with real materials, but of course we also have the Masonic tradition
Mhm.
using stonemasonry as a kind of again a literal image for a
Allegory.
figurative spirit of the
Yeah.
spiritual practice
Yeah.
or something.
Yes.
But the one thing that I thought was cool was that the horizon lay flat and true as a spirit level. So we have this natural phenomenon
Mhm.
being compared to a piece of technology,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is, and a piece of technology that is used to create a structure for dwelling.
Mhm.
It's really kind of an interesting metaphor, and As soon as because I think I was kind of looking for similes when I was
Mhm.
rereading chapter 4, and then I
Yeah.
noticed like the first two are actually the things that whatever is being likened to. The well, the similes are technologically based, or they're about tools and
Yeah, set
instruments.
sight. Well, the second one is like he set his sight on his gun like a man using a micrometer. You notice
Yeah,
that one too.
yeah,
And a micrometer is also for masonry and measuring as well. So those
yeah.
two things and being a metaphor for the human character.
But there it's a tool being likened to another
Oh,
tool, you know?
totally. It
So
is
we've got nature
bizarre.
likened to a tool. So here
Yeah,
we have kind of two different domains that
yeah,
are being likened. And then we have, two things being likened that belong to the same domain. And
true.
similes are really interesting because it can help us connect one concrete domain to another, but it can also help us connect domains, different kinds of domains, and
Mm,
therefore different kinds of ideas, so it can help us relate the concrete to the abstract, or, the physical to the metaphysical.
true. You know, I do remember learning about simile in grade school, and I remember being blown away. I just remember like, what? It blew my mind. And I mean, and it would have been grade 4 or 5. I don't know what I did with it. I think I did start to write a little bit of poetry around grade 7, though, I will say. But it really did blow my
Didn't
mind.
everybody
Didn't everybody? I know, that's
write
right.
poetry in grade 7?
So true. So I've got like 2, 4, 6, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. I've got at least 25 similes here
Wow.
before we get to the more than at least 25 before we get to the climax, where I found only 3 in that very active part. Um, so I mean, like a company of painted clowns, set the glass on his chest like a crucifix, like runes of old walls. I mean, that's a rune being described as a rune, like you said. So you're using something to describe what it is. Stones broken off like the stumps of great stone trebles. There it is again. Stones being described as stones.
Right.
Shoes of horses like eyes winking across desert floor. Livid like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone but fear. There's your sentence.
Yeah, that's the one. That's one of the ones I absolutely love. I mean,
Um,
the idea of an order whose geology is not stone but fear. Well, first of all, one of the reasons why I love that is, again, like talking about the self-similarity of this text.
correct.
Everything kind of like echoes, or, refers to something else in the text. Almost very Finnegan's Wakian in a way, but that 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 association of stone and fear
Mm-hmm.
will come back in the judge's speech about the Anasazi, or the Pueblan ruins that the camp that the gang are camped at, or bivouacked at overnight, and at one point.
And it definitely takes us back to page 4 with what kind of creature are we? What kind of an animal are we? In all the world's turning, are we some kind of clay or do we have any control? I mean, clay is basically wet stone, wet microscopic stones, right?
Yeah,
So the
yeah,
stone, right? Stone is a reoccurring motif.
just like the geology of fear. It's just,
Yes.
well, like geology, or an order made of not stone but fear.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of like, human organization seems, like more, well, human societies do seem, like the way the earth is sort of like, uh, the land masses are shaped by the movements of tectonic plates. I
Mhm.
like this simile because it does sort of convey to me like how emotion can, sort of act like the movement of tectonic plates and rearrange orders, over and over. I don't know what exactly I'm saying, but
Yeah, yeah.
something about the power of fear, especially.
Mhm.
Fear is, like if this is, McCarthy loved tragedy, and tragedy is the catharsis of negative emotions of pity
Mm,
and fear.
mm.
Fear is really important here. Obviously, like the judge is a terrifying figure. Um, the Comanche are terrifying to to Captain White's.
Well, and
They
nature is
really are.
terrifying. They're vulnerable to snakes, scorpions, and other humans. And so when I hear geology of fear, I just think of that feeling when you go camping sometimes and you're not sure where you are and you're thinking of all this stuff that could get you,
Yeah,
like
and
camping in Montana or something.
Judge Holden, for all his Faustian,
Mm.
you know, um, vibes, or devilish vibes, maybe he's just an incredibly fearful person, because he'll say the least thing can destroy us, so nothing can exist without my consent. That is a kind of a fear-based proposition.
I would concur completely. I would. I mean, in Buddhism, is that there's two emotions, love or fear. So everything he is fear-based, really. You're right. He is like it's amazing he's, so big and strong because you'd think he wouldn't be afraid of anything, but he definitely speaks like he's afraid of things. And he's also terrorizing other people by that. Can you imagine when he's terrified and you're going like, well, if he can't be brave, who can? Oh,
Joyce, by the way, thought human subjectivity was founded on fear. I think
mm,
he thinks fear was a primal emotion.
mm,
And he was one of those types, you know, who didn't like saying "I love you," because
mm.
that was such a momentous thing to say, to somehow express some kind of emotion that was almost void of fear or something. I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. And I think there was a time when people didn't feel comfortable. They saw it as being weak, right? My daughter's grandmother said her mom never said she loved her. It was like, why would you talk like that? Which I found horrendous. So we say in our families all the time that we love each other, or most of us do, not everybody, but you know, it is on trend to baby our children and be, you know,
Yeah.
to invest in them quite a bit. There are emotions. Um, God,
Well,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, like we've read this before, so we know the direction that this is heading, and that this is heading to catastrophe, and
Yeah.
that for all of Captain White's demagoguery and bluster,
Mhm.
that he's on his way to just becoming a pickled head in a jar.
Yes, yes.
Sort of like, I hope, the current American president. But anyways,
Yes. Well, I know that we have
we
a
should leave that.
we have a listener out there. She'll probably kill me. Hi, Janine. But she wanted to know when chapter 4 was dropping. I said soon. And she had never read it before, the novel. And she saw a post I had on Facebook and she was like, I want to read. I went, well, it's violent. I don't know if it's going to be your cup of tea. She goes, no, but come on. I want to read it. So I saw her last week and she had texted me that she was on chapter 6. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing.
Wow.
And then I saw her, and she's from the neighborhood where I work in a bar. And she came into the bar, and I said, "How are you doing?" She goes, "I'm on chapter 10." I was like,
Wow.
"Okay, you're amazing." And then she realized
That's
she had read The
compelling.
Road. I said, "Well, you could read The Road. You could read Blood Meridian. That's almost easier than The Road because
Hey,
Road's depressing."
I'm not on TikTok. I have no idea what that is, but apparently, like, a couple of my students told me today that Blood Meridian is trending on TikTok. I guess there's like a Judge Holden meme or something
Oh,
going around.
really? I'll have to go and try and find that
You'll
and see
have
if
to
I
find
can,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and see if I can video it and then share it or something. Oh, interesting. Don't you love it when people tell you all this stuff?
Yeah, it's great.
And yeah, like John Hillcoat, he's dropping things on Instagram every now and then, like he evening redness of
Oh,
the sky or something. Now he's in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So you're like,
oh.
what?
What are you
Is
doing
it
there?
is it for Blood Meridian? Is it for
I
something
hope
else?
so.
I hope so too. I hope so
But
too.
I was, so like we know the direction that the action is going into,
Yeah.
and like, and the narrator does kind of spell out that this is a doomed enterprise by
Hmm.
that one simile about sleeping in the sand with their hearts beating like pilgrims from the planet Anarita or something like that, right? And so, yeah, I was, looking at what the heck is Anarita, but
Right.
it is a kind of it's a term coming from astrology, and it has to do with like I guess when you're born, you have a ruling planet,
Hmm.
but you also have a killing planet, and that's part of your fate. And so when somehow the ruling planet, which is like the Afita, does connect somehow with the killing planet, that means your life is over. So
Oh,
the moment of your death is the moment when the killing planet has arrived or something like that. And so the killing planet could be, I guess, anything, Mars, Jupiter, like I don't really know. It's so Anarita is just kind of like a name, like not a proper name, but just a functional name or a
maybe like
descriptor,
Arcadia.
maybe like Arcadia.
Maybe.
So like by referring to these filibusters as like pilgrims on the on the planet Anarita, basically the narrator is saying, you know, these guys are about to die.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, it's yeah, the Greek, the when you say it reminds me of astrolabe. So the astrolabe, the spirit level, and the micrometer are all from the 1600s, and they are all considered part of alchemy and the practice of magic in the Renaissance, coming into the Renaissance and beyond. And it's interesting that they're all in this chapter as well. And an astrolabe is a micrometer was invented in 1660. I looked that up. It's composed of several parts, including anvil, screw, thimble, lock, nut, frame, spindle, sleeve, for accurate measuring and machining.
Mm.
So it's a simple tool, but it's actually got several parts to it. So it's quite an amazing tool. And
So it's a machine to make a machine.
it's a machine to make a machine. It kind
Or
of
a
is.
mechanism.
Well, and also the corkscrew was developed, well, there's Archimedes corkscrew, but the corkscrew really came into its own around that time. Maybe someone's going to disagree with me. I don't know. Um, and then we have an astrolabe, which is a round metal disc that can help calculate or identify astronomical positions precisely. And it goes back to ancient times, 300 at least BC. And Chaucer, you're going to love this. I don't know if you know this. He wrote a massive book on the astrolabe. Did you know that?
I did know that
Oh,
actually.
I'm really
I have
surprised
I
because when
have
I
the
first heard that, I was like, "What?" I
I
mean,
have
that's
the
great.
Riverside Complete Chaucer.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean,
It's a
that
beautiful
really,
book.
that's a further evidence of him being interested in suppressed design or secret architecture in work, right? So he really did inspire Spencer and Shakespeare, what they were up
Yep.
to.
He also translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy.
Ooh, ooh.
But like all of these tools and the Astrolab uh simile is kind of funny, right?
Yeah,
Because
how?
like
How
it's
so?
about the wobbly wheels of the wagons, you know.
That is amazing.
And so like there's so many it yeah, again like I feel sometimes I feel like that there are like really big themes in each chapter, like maybe blackness in chapter 2 or
Yeah,
whiteness in
yeah,
chapter 3. This one is sort of very heavily tool based too, and it
yes.
could be that, like we're moving again, like this move from the pastoral to the epic is also a move from just interpersonal violence, the kid like
Oh,
having fights with the
yeah,
Maltese boatswain,
yeah.
to war, to actual
Ooh,
war, and
ooh.
so the tools become really important when we move from mere interpersonal violence, where a smashed alcohol bottle can serve as a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
This thing is like that thing. A
Well, that
bottle is
is
that
right.
weapon.
I love it that the wheels were likened to an astrolabe, and there they are. They don't have a house. They've been dragging this thing that's their only form of domesticity, really. And the astrolabe calculates when the sun enters the house, and that would be what sign in astrology, right? It was entering, so it really does help you tell the time. And the word horoscope comes from Greek, which means nativity and comes from the Latin word horoscopus, and refers to a diagram of the heavens that shows the positions of the planets on a given day. And they do refer to that these fellows traveling out there are getting to know the western skies in new ways and adding their own
That's right.
geology onto it,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Which
that was
brings
really
me
cool.
to the talk about tools. I'm going to kind of, press one of my interesting points. For me, it makes me think about distributed cognition. And
Yeah.
distributed cognition, we've mentioned before, but I'm going to try and clearly do it, is a theory of human cognition that describes how information processing is dispersed across people and their workplace, their technologies and their social organization, and how information processing evolves over time. The idea that the mind does not just reside in our body or brain, it is in our artifacts, our tools, our environments, transformed or transmuted through systems. Our memory, decision making, reasoning, and learning are all collectively processed by our minds and by extensions of our minds in the external world. And that brings me to some of the things I've been talking about of suppressed design or secret architecture of Blood Meridian, which, we can have more time later, but I'll briefly wanted to say some specific things for people to think about that are listening to this um, podcast. So I mentioned patterns of self-similarity in the synoptic chapter titles. I wanted to talk about pagination because the 20th anniversary edition is very close to being 365 pages. So you could have a page for every day of the year. You could turn the corner down on a page and know what day you were on every day, like a gatepost. There's 23 chapters plus an epilogue, which could be for 24 hours a day. On page 46,
Mm.
I always noticed the 46 guys sleeping in their blankets in the first time I read it because it was a very profound description of the night star, the night sky. But on the 25th edition, those 46 men sleeping outside with 46 blankets under self same stars are on page 46. Now, Alan Joseph, about 3 years ago, said, "There's no way, Candy, there could be pagination." I was presenting a paper and I think it was called Hacking Blood Meridian. I was very proud of that title. So I was trying to break down some of these ideas, right? He said, "There's no way." And I said, "Alan, I think there is way because by then he was a huge superstar. He could say, yeah, I'll get the 25th edition, but now I want this to land on this page," which he probably originally wrote that way. And then, so I spend my life in hell trying to figure out what the hell is the significance of 46. It's definitely 2 times 23. And we know that that's considered a kind of a weird, archaic. William Burroughs said that there was a 23 enigma, which Robert Anton Wilson ran away with. So, McCarthy could be having a bit of fun with that, maybe. The 10 of Cups in Tarot is, I think, the 46th card. So we could remember that for when we break down
Oh,
things.
okay.
In our tarot journey, we're trying to keep track of where we might find the tarot card in this book, right? Happiness, joy,
Yeah.
contentment, community, and family. So they might have had that night.
Hey, and you
I,
know that of those 46, the kid was one.
thank you.
If
I was
you,
about to say that. Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry.
I was about to say it. No, no,
No,
you're reading my mind because
okay.
I wanted him to live to 46 years old, but he
But he lives
doesn't.
to 45.
And 45 men die.
Yeah.
It's almost like Elvis dying at 44, half his lifetime because his twin had already died. I always felt haunted when I went to Graceland and there's his twin. And no wonder Elvis lived for two people. Well, maybe the kid was living for 45 people. So yeah, I'm still it's a centered triangular number. Well, 117 is a polygonal number. And 46 are the number of stars on Our Lady Guadalupe's mantle, her shawl, right? In the thing. And
Oh.
those stars and constellations are represented accurately on her. And
Hmm.
what's interesting is somewhere back in the end of the book, the judge is standing on a cliff in the sky and he's wearing a mantle. And I always thought, is he taking over her business, right? In this novel, maybe he's going to be the astrologer or the astronomer. Um, I don't want to bore everybody with my number thing, but I wanted to throw that out. That probably a good enough for today of my looking for patterns. I did do something. I took all the chapter title header, all the synoptic headers, and I put them into one frame to read themselves. So I'm going to put that on our
Oh,
Substack
that would be
page. I
so
just thought it
cool.
would be fun on Substack to be able to look at that.
That would be
And
amazing.
and I never thought of doing it before. It just kind of occurred to me the other day. Maybe it was because you noticed the setting forth or something like that. You know, because there's a lot of juicy things in those snup. Hocus Docus is coming up in a few chapters. Right? Dickus Dickus or something? Yeah.
Hickeus Dickeus?
Dickius Dickius.
I don't know.
Wow.
But like, yeah, the setting forth. So it's chapter four, but the first word of chapter four is five.
I I know. So I think that there's a lot of fun things like that, a lot of crazy fun things like that. Um there's several references in this chapter, maybe several is too strong a term, maybe three or four of the world turning, so we're going to come to that. It does come up in the novel several times, maybe only in this chapter three times. uh
It's
and
one
then,
thing I did kind of want to talk about a little bit because I'm again like history is not my strong suit.
well, it's not mine
Um,
either.
but but the attack by the Comanche is
Yes.
interesting on a whole bunch of levels,
Yeah,
right?
we do need to talk about that.
Um, well, and also rhetorically, it's interesting too because another one of McCarthy's kind of signature figures is polysyndeton, which is a fancy word, a way of saying like this writer likes to use and, right? So
Mhm.
like in the Comanche attack, it's like, and some look like this and some look like that. So it's just this kind of massive cataloging and amplification um of the scene that gives it a kind of like terrifying sublimity or whatever. So the polysyndeton is really interesting. You
Mhm.
know, a philosopher like Gilles Deleuze would say, like a philosophy of the and is, a philosophy of connections rather than causes. So
Ooh.
I don't know. I guess I'd have to think more about that. But the Captain White is like really unlucky because, well, first of all, and speaking of similes, one of the ones I find hilarious is the one where the filibusters are described like armed and mounted millers wandering in dementia.
Yeah.
First of all, millers is just they're the people who grind the corn, like they're the
Mhm.
least suited to like fighting war. And
Mhm.
so they're wandering armed millers, which sounds ridiculous, right? But to add on injury to insult, they're wandering in dementia.
Mhm.
So it's like
Definitely.
they have no idea what they're doing, and they're about to find out how foolish they truly were.
Yes.
And Captain White, um, his like evil star was very mocking because he encounters the Comanche, and the Comanche were incredibly well organized.
Mhm.
They were, a small group of filibusters like Captain White's outfit or the Glanton gang would have never stood. Not the Glanton gang seems so like heroic and unstoppable, but they would have also like been slaughtered, I feel, in this Comanche attack. And
Yes.
so interesting that Glanton mainly chases after Apache,
Mhm.
and there is some historical work on the Comanche that I've been reading to try to get a sense of like the scalp trade and stuff like that. And they do, and this one author at least kind of says that the Apache were much more vulnerable to these kinds of attacks.
Mhm. Interesting. Yeah, and then the Comanche are just like, yeah, it's like going up against the Vatos in Chicago. You would just stay away.
But like, and again, it's maybe. Well, I think, did you find something? Because
Hmm.
I was thinking, like, I did a little bit of research, or
Oh,
I should
yes, I did
say, I
find
had like
something.
a research assistant doing
Yes.
some research
Yes.
because at some point I thought that I don't think the Comanche actually dressed that way in war, and so I kind of thought maybe this vision of, a parody of Attic and biblical like characters with them wearing bloodstained wedding veils and top hats and blah 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 or whatever, that this
Right.
was actually kind of a fantasy, a racist kind of fantasy. But
Yes, I think
what did
that
you find again?
I
You
do
actually
not
found something.
think that they did do that. And also there was warfare where people did, um, there was the idea of raping and sodomizing the dead
Right, right,
and
yeah.
living. There was some, but was it as crazy as in this? I don't know. There
Mm.
was some because it felt like showing how terrible a warrior you were, and they not that they did not dismiss women, but that you were like a woman not able to fight, but they didn't mean it to their women. Clothes and raids. Yeah. Um, I didn't find a lot about whether or not they were taking their own clothes. Definitely they would steal kids, perhaps. The thing is, I think you're right. It is like a horror scene. It's more like your worst ideas. The Comanches did decorate their ponies with ribbons and they did paint them. Whether or not they wore Texan clothing as they shouted triumphantly. But this was in the Great Comanche Raid of 1840. So maybe
Okay.
that's where he got it and galloped up and down the smoke-darkened streets. So there is some accounts, and I think it's also though how terrifying to think not only am I going to be killed, my stuff is going to be stolen from me. My identity is going to be stolen. And that is a classic kind of killing scene, even in The Counselor, Javier Bardem gets killed and the kids steal his watch and his boots and everything, right? We see that in the Westerns, very classic. But I don't know how much of that is, like you said, is that just a racist stereotype? Do they really want to wear wedding veils? Um, I don't know. But damn, it's good. It definitely
It's
scares the shit out of you when you read it, you
it's
know?
it's one of the reasons why the novel has this reputation of being inordinately violent.
Yes. Yes,
Even
that's
though
probably
even
the
though a
first
lot of the
time.
sentences are there is no violence.
But it's a scene like that where you're kind of like overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
again, there's something about the way the narrator goes into the moment. There's something else in here. There's a paragraph that came along, and I was like, "Oh my God, this paragraph, I think it might be on, I don't know, it's on one of the early pages, like 47. And it's probably about 40 words and it's one paragraph, one sentence, which I remember thinking you're not allowed to write a paragraph with one sentence. It has to be three, right? So he has that, but I'm laughing. I'm laughing at that because later in the chapter, there's a paragraph that has 249 words, and I counted them. And no one sentence. It's one
One
sentence.
sentence.
It's
Yeah.
one sentence, 249 words. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I counted it a couple of times and I was making sure I didn't miss a period, but I was like, well, he's just having so much fun with this, breaking every rule. And, why should there be a rule? It should be there to expand. So,
Well, it's a very Germanic thing to do one
is it?
sentence of hundreds of words. Yeah. Oh God, yeah. It's
Oh,
terrible. Like
oh,
you read Immanuel Kant and it's
yeah.
like a
Oh,
nightmare.
wow. Is it just to keep that train of the thought so big?
Maybe it's the thought is so big, but like here it's, like the polysyndeton, this
Yes,
and in
yes.
a way it kind of makes me think of like trauma. The idea of trauma is like there's an event that is so overwhelming, you can't fathom it all in the moment, right? So many things have happened that
That's it.
the reason why you have PTSD is because you were in an event that was overwhelming. And so your PTSD is like trying to remember
Yeah,
everything and
yeah.
trying to be master of a situation that you weren't the master of in the moment, right?
That's very
And so
true.
this and it's like this is happening and that's happening and and this horrible thing is happening and that horrible thing and it's just overwhelming, and so it is kind of, so maybe the polysyndeton of like the massive sentences with all of these kind of connectors words that it's sort of like this is what war is like. It's absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah, and in fact, that might be the part that's most Bosch-like. You know how many readers go, "Oh, it's just like Bosch painting." Well,
Yeah,
in a way, it's not actually. It's not. There's normal. There's conventional storytelling things go on, but in a scene like that, all of a sudden, it is as if the narrator is trying to have all of this stuff on one screenshot in your mind at the same time. And how do you do that as a writer? So
right.
I think you're onto something there with that idea, and that we're getting traumatized while we read it in
While reading it, but in a pleasurable way,
a
right? Because,
pleasurable way, in a
or,
spectacle.
why do we keep coming back to this novel? Because there's so much in it, and we weren't able to master it the first time, or the
Definitely.
second time, or the 100th
Yeah,
time.
right. I'm just reading it again because I'm terrible at comprehension.
But that's the sublime.
That
That's the
is the
aesthetics
sublime.
of this mathematical sublime.
That
It's
is
just like
true.
there's too much.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely, and I'm thinking that was just this chapter this week, you know? And every week I felt like there was so much to look at. Every time we are doing an episode, every time we do a chapter, it's
I
kind of
know.
amazing.
Yeah, it's great. It's really
It is.
great.
It
It's
is.
so fun to read slowly and
Mm-hmm.
kind of just focused on one thing at a time.
Mm-hmm. And we would love to hear from anyone out there who's listening. We know someone's listening. We know someone's out there. We did get some texts. I've had some personal messages from some of you. Don't worry, I won't say your name on here. Um, definitely, we would love to hear from you. You could tell us not to say your name and leave a message for us, or tell us what you think, or are we missing something? I mean, of course we are.
Of
Of course
course we
we
are.
can't. We can't know everything. We
Just
can try.
almost everything.
Yeah, just almost everything. How do you feel about this chapter? How do you feel about the podcast? Anything? Do you have time? When are you listening? Are you listening in the car? Are you listening at home? Are you listening while you do the dishes? Anything you feel like telling us?
We just need you to acknowledge that we exist because we're not really sure if we do.
Well, and also these are novels of witnesses.
That's
Cormac
right.
McCarthy
Yes.
has the essence of witnessing in his novels. So I guess we need a little witnessing. Can I get a witness?
Can I get a witness, please? Yeah, there's you and me, Candy, but
That's right.
we need that tertium quid. We need that third thing, or
That's right.
just like a simile, right? A simile has three parts.
That's right.
It's got the tenor, it's got the vehicle, and then it's got the connecting device.
Just like Antony and Cleopatra, there too, but the number three is in the play many, many times.
Well, it's that and.
Yeah, that and yes.
There it is.
All right. Well, great talking to you, and we may have to carry this as a part two. We don't know yet.
Yeah, we don't
We'll find
know.
out.
I feel like we've missed
I
almost
feel
everything.
Me too. I feel like we've forgotten everything we said we were going to talk about today, and I was looking at our notes. Later, I'm going to be like, God damn it. Okay, well, thank you for listening.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Candy.
Thank you.
I'll see you next time.
See you next time.